A retired, disabled veteran bought a forgotten storage unit with a huge crate. What he found inside shocked him. Subscribe so you don't miss our new stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Marcus Ellis awakened before dawn, as he did every morning, not because he wanted to, but because his body insisted on reminding him that rest was a luxury he no longer fully possessed. A dull ache pulsed through the place where his left leg had once been, phantom pain twisting into something sharp enough to force his eyes open. He lay still for a moment, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling, waiting for his breath to catch up with the slow, stubborn rhythm of his heartbeat. The house around him remained quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that never felt peaceful. It was the quiet of a life paused, of days blending into one another without anyone noticing. He pushed himself upright, rubbing his temples with the heel of his hand before reaching over the edge of the bed. His fingers brushed against the cold metal clasp of his prosthetic, and the sensation grounded him more than comforted him. The fitting process took time, every day a reminder that part of him was gone forever. He had spent decades moving through the world on two strong legs, and yet the muscle memory of walking was now a lie his body told itself. He secured the straps, tightened them with practiced motions, and waited until the prosthetic felt like something he could depend on, at least for a few hours. His bedroom was small, barely large enough for the bed, and a narrow dresser with chipped edges and drawers that stuck if pulled too quickly. The walls were covered with a faded paint that once might have been a warm beige, but now hovered somewhere closer to gray. A single picture frame hung above the dresser, containing a photograph of younger men in uniform, faces sunburned, dusty, and wide-eyed with adrenaline. Marcus stood slightly apart from the group in the picture, one hand raised in a confident salute, the other gripping his helmet. The camera had captured him in a moment when he still believed the world made sense. He glanced at the photo only briefly before turning away, unwilling to let nostalgia take hold so early in the day. The hallway outside his bedroom creaked under his weight as he moved toward the kitchen. Every board in this old house protested at even the smallest shift, and Marcus had long stopped trying to fix the noises. They were part of the place, like him, worn and stubborn in their refusal to give up. The kitchen greeted him with the stale scent of leftover coffee grounds and the metallic tang of the faucet he always meant to replace. He filled a small dented kettle and set it on the stove, letting the flame flicker to life. The dim heat was enough to chase the chill from the air, and he leaned against the counter, letting the warmth creep slowly into his hands. His morning routine rarely varied. Coffee, a slice of plain toast, a pillbox opened with slow fingers so he could swallow 3 tablets that tasted like chalk and bitterness. All of it done with the mechanical efficiency of someone who could not afford to lose time, even if time was the only thing he had in abundance. When the kettle whistled, he poured the water over a scoop of cheap coffee grounds in a chipped mug that had survived more years than any other dish in the house. The aroma was thin but familiar. It reminded him that he was still here. He limped into the living room, lowering himself onto the sagging couch that bore the imprint of his weight from countless mornings just like this one. A stack of envelopes sat on the coffee table. Bills, mostly. The electricity notice struck him first, bright red letters barking a warning about the upcoming due date. He stared at the paper for a long moment and sighed. His disability check would arrive soon, but most of it was already spoken for. What little remained would vanish as quickly as it came. Money had become something he handled cautiously, counting out each dollar with the same care he once used to clean his rifle. He reached for the television remote, then stopped mid-motion. The room was already full of noise, even if none of it came from speakers. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the rustle of the wind against the aging siding, the faint hum of his prosthetics' alignment sockets, the voices inside his mind, quieter now but still present, carrying fragments of radio reports, shouted commands, explosions that never quite faded from memory. He exhaled slowly and let his hand fall away from the remote. The silence, as heavy as it could be, was easier to bear than waking old ghosts. His gaze drifted to the medals sitting in a small wooden box on the bookshelf. They were reminders of service that others occasionally praised but rarely understood. The world liked to call veterans heroes, but some evenings when Marcus sat alone with a cup of cheap coffee and a body full of scars, he wondered if survival was really something worth celebrating. His left pant leg, neatly pinned in place below the knee, was a mute answer to that question. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had come home, only to lose everything pieces at a time. He lifted himself from the couch and hobbled toward the front door, pausing to slip into a worn jacket that smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. The lock stuck for a moment, as if hesitant to let him leave, but eventually relented with a reluctant click. The morning air outside greeted him like a cold slap, crisp and unforgiving. The street was quiet, lined with modest single-story homes just like his. Some were well kept, others swallowed by neglect. His fell somewhere in the middle, a tired structure that still held on to dignity even as time tried to strip it away. He made his way down the step that wobbled slightly under his weight. That step had been a concern for months now. He knew it needed repair, but each time he thought about spending money on wood or tools, something more urgent took priority. With winter closing in, he worried what might happen if the wood finally gave out. The thought sent a tremor of unease through his chest. Everything in his life had an expiration date, and he feared that this house, this fragile symbol of independence, was inching closer to its own. He walked slowly toward the bus stop. He didn't have a clear destination in mind, only the urge to move, even if movement was painful. Staying in the house, trapped with nothing but his thoughts, felt worse. The bus arrived with a screech of brakes, and Marcus climbed aboard, gripping the handrail tightly as he maneuvered his prosthetic across the first step. The driver gave him a polite nod, one of those gestures that people offered to veterans out of obligation more than genuine care. Marcus nodded back and shuffled toward an empty seat. The bus carried him across town, past grocery stores and gas stations, past parks where children would later gather and laugh in a way that people his age rarely remembered. He watched the scenery slide by like a movie in which he had no starring role. Most of the passengers didn't even glance his way. He was invisible, or maybe just unremarkable. A man who had lived too long to be noticed and not long enough to be someone's memory. After a while, he realized the bus was heading toward the storage district, a place where people's forgotten possessions waited in metal containers behind chain-link fences. He remembered seeing a flyer taped to the window of the corner store days earlier, announcing a storage unit auction. The date printed on it matched today. It wasn't fate, he told himself, but it felt like some kind of nudge. He pressed the black button, mounted on the rail, and stood carefully as the bus slowed to a stop. The storage facility stretched across a wide lot, rows of orange doors gleaming under the pale morning sun. A small crowd had gathered near one of the rows, people chatting and shuffling clipboards, all wearing the eager expressions of bargain hunters hoping for a jackpot. Marcus hesitated at the edge of the group, unsure whether he belonged there. He didn't have the money to chase treasures, and he didn't have the energy for pointless competition. Still, curiosity pulled him closer. There was nothing waiting for him at home except silence, and silence was the one thing he needed a break from. He tucked his hands into the pockets of his jacket and followed the group as they moved toward the first storage door. The auctioneer, a brisk man with a booming voice, announced each lot with dramatic flair. Marcus listened with mild detachment as people placed bids, laughed, grumbled, and moved on. He studied the faces around him, recognizing the hunger in their eyes. They were searching for something to flip, a stroke of luck that would pay their bills for a month or two. He understood that desperation intimately. The storage doors clattered open one by one. Inside the first was a pile of dusty furniture, tangled extension cords, and a cracked aquarium. The second held stacks of crumbling cardboard boxes and what might once have been a treadmill. The crowd reacted with murmurs of either disappointment or opportunity, depending on their perspectives. Marcus kept his distance, feeling like an observer rather than a participant. With each new unit, he expected to lose interest and return home. But something kept him there, a vague sense that this outing had meaning beyond mere distraction. He followed the group deeper into the maze of rows toward the section where sunlight struggled to reach. It wasn't noise that pulled him forward, but the absence of it. The crowd seemed quieter here, as though uncertainty had crept in alongside the shadows. That was when he saw the door to Storage Unit 47. It had a faded number painted on the front and a thick layer of dust that suggested no one had touched it for years. The auctioneer paused and lifted the door with a grunt, and the metal groaned in protest as it rolled upward. A stale gust of air escaped the dark interior, revealing almost nothing inside except a single shape looming near the back. Marcus blinked, focusing on the object. It was a massive wooden crate, larger than any packing box he'd seen in his years in the service. The corners were reinforced with metal brackets, and the wood itself seemed aged but strong, like something designed to withstand time and travel. The crate sat stubbornly in the shadows, dominating the space with a silent, imposing presence. The crowd hesitated. A few people laughed quietly, unimpressed. Someone muttered that the box was probably empty or filled with junk too heavy to bother with. Marcus felt something else entirely. A stirring in his chest, a pull he couldn't explain. The crate reminded him of supply shipments he'd seen on the front, crates that carried equipment essential to survival. The kind of container someone put effort into, not because it held trash, but because it guarded value. The auctioneer called for the opening bid. No hands rose. Marcus didn't think. The decision formed in his body before it reached his mind. His hand lifted slowly as though drawn upward by invisible strings. A few heads turned toward him with mild surprise. Another bidder half-heartedly entered the fray, but his interest was shallow and easily extinguished. Moments later, the auctioneer's gavel slammed down, and the lot belonged to Marcus. He inhaled sharply, a flicker of anxiety writhing beneath his ribs. He had just spent money he could barely afford to lose on a mysterious crate he didn't understand. But the deed was done, and as he stepped away from the cluster of buyers, he couldn't deny the small spark of energy that had ignited within him. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was something quieter and more urgent. For the first time in a long while, he had made a choice fueled by instinct rather than necessity. And though he couldn't yet articulate why, a strange certainty settled in his bones that this crate, this forgotten remnant hiding at the edge of the storage yard, was meant to find him and no one else. Marcus Ellis began the slow journey home with his unusual purchase, unaware that this decision, this seemingly insignificant flicker of curiosity, was about to shift the entire axis of his quiet, constrained existence. For the first time in years, as he limped away from the crowd, he felt the faintest sense of purpose stirring back to life. He didn't know what waited inside that crate, but the world outside his own had finally knocked, and he was ready to answer. Marcus hadn't expected anything remarkable to come from his morning bus ride. He had boarded with no agenda, no plan, and certainly no idea that he would walk away having purchased a massive, mysterious crate. Yet, as he arranged for the storage facility staff to load it into a rental truck and then followed behind in a taxi, he felt a strange mix of dread and curiosity clawing at his chest. The kind of feeling that arrives when a life too quiet is suddenly disturbed, when the still water of stagnant years ripples from the smallest dropped stone. The truck rattled through the narrow streets as Marcus clutched the dashboard, bracing for every bump and turn. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his brow, made small talk about the weather and the city's losing football team. Marcus nodded where appropriate, his eyes fixed on the large box that swayed in the back through the glass. The sun glinted off the metal bands wrapped around the wooden panels, making the crate look less like abandoned scrap and more like a relic of some forgotten mission. Marcus wondered briefly if anyone had ever intended for it to be moved again. The truck finally pulled to a stop outside his modest home. The driver hopped out and helped Marcus maneuver the unloading ramp into place. Even with both of them pushing, the crate barely responded. They resorted to a dolly, muscles strained and faces twisted with effort as they coaxed the enormous box down into Marcus's driveway. The structure thudded heavily onto the cracked concrete, the sound resonating through the bones of the house. The driver gave Marcus a skeptical look, as if questioning what business an old man with a prosthetic leg had with a crate that weighed as much as a small vehicle. Marcus avoided the man's eyes and paid him quietly, mumbling his thanks. When the truck rumbled away and left him there alone, Marcus stared at the crate for a long moment. He rested his palm against the wood, feeling the grain beneath his skin. The surface was rough in places, with deep grooves carved by time or travel, yet there was a care in its construction that even his untrained hand could recognize. Someone had built this with intention. Someone who believed what they were protecting deserved the extra effort. For the first time, Marcus wondered if buying the crate had been a mistake. Heavy secrets tended to weigh more than just the wood that concealed them. He swallowed hard and retrieved a crowbar from his shed, though calling the small metal structure behind his house a shed was generous. It was little more than rusted sheet metal nailed together around a few old tools that Marcus kept out of stubbornness more than hope. He tested the crowbar's strength, then returned to the crate, planting the tool's flat end into the narrow crack where the lid met the walls. His arms tensed and the prosthetic leg shifted awkwardly under his weight as he pried upward, wood resisting with every inch. A small groan of strain escaped him, followed by a louder creak from the crate. The sound was like a sigh escaping a chest long sealed shut. The lid finally gave way with a reluctant snap. Marcus stumbled back, catching himself just before he fell. A puff of old dust rose into the air, particles swirling through sunlight like tiny ghosts. He coughed into his sleeve and leaned forward once more, heart pounding with the intensity of a man opening not just a box, but perhaps a different life. What greeted him inside was not treasure, nor anything that looked particularly valuable at first glance. Wooden parts, carefully wrapped in thick canvas, lay stacked in neat bundles. He lifted one, his fingers brushing over soft fabric that smelled faintly of cedar, varnish, and something older. The shape within felt like a panel, rectangular and smooth beneath his touch. He laid the bundle gently on the ground and unwrapped it. A carved wooden door panel emerged from the fabric like a piece of artwork hiding in plain sight. The details stunned him. Vines elegantly intertwined across the surface, leaves so delicately etched that their veins appeared almost real. Marcus ran a calloused finger over the design, his breath catching at the craftsmanship. Whoever had created this piece didn't just know wood, they revered it. He continued pulling out more items, curved chair legs, not yet sanded but marked with precise pencil lines that charted their intended futures. Small drawers meant to slide into something grander. Templates cut from thin plywood with labels handwritten along the edges. A life's work packed with meticulous care, yet unfinished, as though the creator had been interrupted mid-project and never returned. Marcus felt something stir within him, a sense of kinship he hadn't expected. Woodworking wasn't his craft, but craftsmanship itself was a language he understood. Soldiers weren't trained to build, but they learned to respect what stood strong. He picked up a set of chisels wrapped in oiled cloth and held one in his palm. The balance was perfect, handle worn smooth by familiar use. Someone had used this tool thousands of times, shaping and smoothing, making splinters into something beautiful. He found himself imagining the man who had packed this crate. Perhaps someone like him, who had put his heart into a trade the world no longer valued. Someone who had grown older and watched life shrink around him. Maybe this crate was a past he couldn't carry but couldn't bear to abandon. The thought unsettled Marcus in ways he couldn't quite define. He wiped his brow and sat back on the edge of the step leading up to his house. His prosthetic throbbed, and he allowed himself a moment to breathe. Across the yard, leaves rustled under the touch of a light breeze. The world continued, unbothered by the mysteries now sitting in his driveway. He returned to the crate, determined to finish what he'd started. Slowly, carefully, he unwrapped each piece, placing them into neat rows on an old blanket. Soon, the scattered puzzle of wood and metal spread before him like the remnants of a forgotten workshop. He began to see a pattern, a set of projects interrupted mid-progress, each representing hours of patience and skill. He wondered if the creator had hoped to someday return to finish them. Underneath the carved panels, he discovered a narrow wooden box with a sliding lid. Inside were receipts from lumber yards, handwritten notes from clients, invoices folded and yellowed by time. Addresses from neighborhoods Marcus recognized, places where houses sold for far more than he could imagine paying. This man, whoever he was, had once made a good living crafting custom pieces. Not cheap furniture, but pieces meant to be admired and passed down. Marcus recognized some of the neighborhood names printed on the papers. He had driven through Brentwood once and remembered the manicured lawns and tall white columns like something out of a movie. Lakeview, too, with its lakeside mansions that reflected gold in the sunlight. This craftsman had not worked for just anyone. He had crafted for people who prized beauty and durability. A quiet, almost sorrowful admiration swelled within Marcus. Someone had spent years pouring effort into this art, only for it to end locked away in a box, forgotten behind a flickering security light. Marcus knew too well how easily the world forgot people who had once played important roles. He felt it every time a stranger walked past him without seeing the veteran pin on his jacket or the slight limp that told more of his story than he ever could. As he dug deeper, his curiosity intensifying, he noticed something curious. The crate, despite the large number of items he had removed, barely seemed lighter. More troubling still, the interior depth did not match the exterior height. He frowned, measuring again with a tape he kept in his pocket. His calculations confirmed a discrepancy. The crate had a secret. He knelt and tapped the bottom boards lightly with his knuckles. The echo was muted, as though something dense pressed up against the wood from below. The sound was wrong for a hollow box resting directly on concrete. Marcus felt a surge of alertness sweep through him, a sensation he had not felt since the battlefield. There was more here than met the eye. His pulse quickened. He leaned in, searching every seam and nail head inside the crate. In the right corner, he spotted a fastener set slightly deeper than the others, its head smaller and unfamiliar. He checked the opposite corner and found an identical one. Two more hid at the back corners, forming a precise rectangle. It was clever, expertly disguised. Marcus's breath caught. This was no ordinary packing method. This was a hidden compartment. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the wood. His mind replayed the auctioneer's casual remark about the weight and how the staff had once tried to move the crate but failed. 800 pounds. Far too heavy for wooden tools alone. Whatever still lay inside had mass and meaning. The air felt different now, thicker, as though the crate itself guarded its final secret with intent. Marcus glanced toward the street, cautious. He imagined eyes watching him from the shadows, interest stirring where silence once reigned. But the road was empty, the world still oblivious to the discovery at his feet. He realized he needed to rest before attempting the compartment. His body reminded him in no uncertain terms that he was no longer the soldier who could carry his squad's gear without complaint. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his pants, and began gathering the items he had laid out. The chisels went into the shed. The carved panels leaned against the wall inside his garage. The smaller tools and documents he placed into boxes he could easily move later. He was organizing his world around something new, though he wasn't fully aware of it yet. By the time he had arranged everything neatly, the crate loomed behind him like a silent guardian, its secret unopened but acknowledged. He slid his hand along the side once more, absorbing the weight of what he was about to uncover. Wild thoughts flickered through his mind. Money, weapons, evidence of something that might trouble people still out there. It didn't matter. He had already come too far. The crate's secret was now his responsibility. As daylight began to wane, Marcus stood in his driveway and stared at the crate. He felt exhaustion tug at him, but beneath it, a sense of purpose simmered. Buying the crate had been impulsive. Opening it had been necessary. What came next was inevitable. He locked up the garage and limped toward his front door. The failing step creaked beneath him, but this time he barely noticed. His thoughts lingered behind him, trapped in that wooden prison waiting for the right moment to speak. The house greeted him with familiar silence, but it no longer suffocated him the way it had that morning. Something had shifted in the air, something subtle but undeniable. That quiet spark from earlier had grown warmer. Marcus didn't know what the hidden compartment held, but he knew it would change him. He set his coat on the chair, eased himself down onto the couch, and stared at his hands. They trembled slightly from the strain of the day's labor, but that tremor felt like life. Real, demanding life. He had spent years waking up to emptiness. Now, for the first time since he returned home from war, his tomorrow felt different. The future wasn't a blank page anymore. It held possibility. It held questions worth answering. Marcus leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Sleep took him quickly, deeper than he had fallen into in years. And in the darkness behind his eyelids he saw the crate, no longer just a box, but a doorway waiting to be opened. Morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with the groaning ache that traveled from Marcus's spine down into the socket where metal met flesh. It was the kind of pain that taught a man patience, the kind that demanded deep breaths and slow movements before anything else could begin. He lay staring at the ceiling again, wondering how a single day could change the weight of silence in his home. Yesterday, he had awakened with nothing ahead but hours to fill. Today, a crate waited in his yard, filled with questions that pressed against his thoughts until they crowded out everything else. He eased himself upright and fitted his prosthetic with more determination than the morning before. His body protested, stiff from yesterday's work, but his mind pushed him forward with urgency. The kettle whistled too loudly in the kitchen as he brewed the usual cup of bitter coffee. He didn't bother with toast. His appetite was tangled up in anticipation and unease, and breakfast could wait until his curiosity was satisfied. Outside, the air was crisp enough to nip at his fingertips. A light film of dew clung to the lid of the crate, making the wood gleam faintly where the first hints of sun brushed it. Marcus paused at the edge of the driveway, taking in the sight of the hidden compartment he had discovered but not yet conquered. His pulse quickened. The crate had become something more than a wooden box. It felt like a challenge, a sealed door between him and a story that had begun long before he arrived. He fetched a flashlight and kneeled beside the crate, ignoring how the cold concrete seeped through his pants and tightened his muscles. He traced the faint seams again, confirming the rectangle where the secret floor waited to be revealed. The corners where the disguised fasteners sat looked even less like nails in the daylight. They resembled dowels, circular and smooth, a craftsman's clever disguise to keep prying hands away from what mattered most. Marcus worked slowly, positioning the crowbar's flat edge beneath the seam, careful not to splinter the wood. The metal creaked under his weight, his jaw clenched as he pressed down. At first, nothing happened, as if the crate were refusing him outright. Then, a tremor ran through the board, a small shift like the first crack in a sealed tomb. He paused, catching his breath, listening for any sound from the neighborhood. The rumble of a car, a barking dog, footsteps. Nothing but the soft hum of wind passing leaves. He pushed again. A groan rose from the crate's bones, low and wary, as though it resented being forced to surrender its last secret. Finally, the board lifted just enough for Marcus to wedge his fingers underneath. He winced when the strain hit his back, but he didn't let go. Inch by inch, he pulled the panel free until it came loose with a sharp sigh of old wood releasing tension stored for decades. The hidden compartment exposed beneath was not deep, no more than 8 inches from the false floor to the crate's true base. But within that shallow space lay rows of neatly arranged canvas bundles. Each was tied tightly with coarse twine, the knots uniform and expertly tied. There were 6 of them, aligned with such precision that they looked more like tools placed in a surgeon's tray than objects of storage. Marcus set the panel aside and lifted the closest bundle into his lap. The canvas felt rigid, almost waxed, as though treated to preserve whatever lay within. It was surprisingly heavy, too heavy for mere scraps or spare parts. His palms tingled as he worked the knot loose. The twine fell away, and he unfolded the cloth. Inside, another layer wrapped the object, this one softer, like flannel worn smooth by time. He peeled it back, revealing a gleam of dark metal that caught the rising sunlight. It was a rectangular lockbox, about the size of a shoebox, but far denser. Its surface bore faint scratches, the kind left by deliberate handling rather than neglect. A small brass plate near the latch held a number engraved by hand, the lines so neat they appeared etched by a machine. Marcus's chest tightened beneath a sudden wave of caution. He had expected tools or personal items hidden below, but this was something humans hid when they feared others might take it. He glanced at the other bundles. All appeared to be identical in size and shape, except one slightly larger than the rest. Whatever secrets this craftsman had sealed away, they were consistent, plentiful, and heavy. He placed the lockbox aside carefully and reached for the next bundle, unable to resist the impulse to confirm his suspicion. The second, too, held a metal box, as did the third, and the fourth. He stopped before the fifth, his breath uneven. 6 metal boxes hidden beneath a workshop's worth of unfinished dreams. For a long moment, he simply sat there, elbows on his knees, staring into the crate's belly. The idea that he might be intruding on something dangerous lingered like a shadow. Men didn't hide lockboxes in secret compartments for trivial reasons. He had known soldiers who stored evidence of things they'd done in war, things they wanted kept out of the world's sight. He'd known civilians who hid valuables from thieves or money from banks they no longer trusted. And he'd known desperate souls whose secrets were buried because revealing them would destroy everything. Marcus set the second lockbox beside the first and wiped his palms on his jeans. He needed a tool to open them properly, something finer than a crowbar, something that wouldn't damage what might be a rare or delicate locking mechanism. But even without opening them, he could feel that these boxes were at the heart of the crate's mystery. He considered returning inside to rest his back and gather his thoughts, but a nagging instinct urged him to keep going. He leaned down again to check the floor of the hidden compartment. The bottom boards were lined with tar paper, thick and durable. It reinforced his belief. This space wasn't slapped together. It was engineered with intention, with future discovery in mind, but only by the right person. He eased the fifth bundle into the light. This one was thicker, bulkier. His fingers fumbled slightly at the knot, and it finally gave way. Instead of a metal box, a dark leather satchel emerged, cracked at the edges but well cared for at some point in its life. The leather creaked as he opened it, and a familiar smell rose from within. Paper, dust, a faint trace of tobacco. He withdrew a stack of papers bundled tightly with string, receipts again, but older now, pawn slips, bank deposit notes, handwritten lists. Some pages carried the faded insignia of institutions that no longer existed. He recognized historic bank logos, the kind he'd seen only in newspapers or museums. Several documents bore dates from decades earlier, years long before Marcus had even been born. He traced his thumb along a ledger page filled with careful handwriting that tracked transactions of what appeared to be considerable amounts of money. The sums were not the kind a craftsman usually stumbled into by accident. Whoever had hidden this was not merely a woodworker. They were someone who had lived through financial disasters and learned not to trust the world with their wealth. The sun climbed higher, warming Marcus's shoulders, but he hardly noticed. His mind spun with implications. The impressive craftsmanship, the expensive tools, the unfinished furniture pieces, had they been a front? Or was the owner a man burdened by a dual life, both creator and survivor, forced to hide what he valued most because he feared losing everything? The questions piled up like sawdust, impossible to brush aside. Marcus settled back and took a deep breath, trying to pace himself. He had spent years waking up with nothing to look forward to beyond a battle with his own body's limitations. Now he sat inches above a mystery that stretched back generations. His heart, long accustomed to beating against disappointment, struggled to keep steady beneath the rush of possibility. He gently covered the lockboxes again and stood, using the lip of the crate to lift himself without jarring his prosthetic. His leg throbbed from the prolonged kneeling, a reminder that excitement did not erase reality. He looked around the neighborhood. The street was calm, but he could not shake the feeling that someone might appear, claiming they had a right to what he'd found. He gathered the boxes and documents and carried them carefully into the garage, setting them atop his workbench. There they sat, silent yet heavy with expectation, while Marcus closed the crate and locked the garage door behind him. He checked the latch twice, then a third time, until he felt sure no one could simply walk in. Inside the house, he sank onto the couch, breathing hard from exertion and from the weight of what he now possessed. He rubbed a palm across his forehead, feeling the tension coil again in his chest. A lifetime of caution told him that when luck appeared in great sums, it was rarely benevolent. But something quieter, hope, crept into the mix too. He stood once more and returned to the garage, flicking on the overhead light. The lockboxes glinted under the bulb's harsh glow. They looked out of place on his weathered workbench, like artifacts from another life dropped into the reality of a man who counted pennies at the grocery store. He slid his hand along the metal surface of one box. There was no keyhole, at least none in plain sight. He repositioned the flashlight, searching for any mechanism that might offer entry. Underneath, he discovered a recessed groove that suggested a lock requiring a specialized tool. A puzzle box built not for speed but for security. Marcus swallowed the knot rising in his throat. The idea of forcing the boxes open with brute strength crossed his mind, but it felt wrong. This crate had been crafted by a person whose hands told stories through wood and metal. Breaking into these lockboxes without care would be a violation of that intent. He stared at the objects, wrestling with uncertainty. He knew he could not leave them unopened forever. Answers lived inside those boxes. Answers that would explain why a craftsman's entire livelihood had been hidden away in a forgotten storage unit. Answers that might alter the course of his own life. But answers could also be dangerous. He stepped back, letting the light fade from the surface of the boxes. His stomach grumbled, reminding him he hadn't eaten. Trembling slightly from adrenaline and fatigue, he returned inside to make himself a sandwich. He sat at the table, chewing without tasting, his attention drifting again and again to the garage beyond. He thought of the night after he had bought the crate, when he had fallen deeper asleep than any night since his last deployment. That sleep had felt like a crack in the armor he had built around himself. The nightmares had been kept at bay by the strange feeling that the crate was protecting him somehow, giving him purpose. Purpose. The word rang through him like a bell. For years he had moved through his days waiting for something he couldn't name. Now he had found something. Not just physical objects, but a mystery that demanded courage and patience to unravel. A challenge that reminded him he was still capable of fighting. Not wars overseas, but battles against the emptiness that had threatened to swallow him whole. He cleaned up the plate and returned to the garage. With slow care, he retrieved each lockbox and documents, placing them neatly inside an old cabinet he rarely used. He closed the cabinet door and locked it. His fingers lingered on the key, and he slipped it into his pocket as though guarding something precious. He turned off the garage light and stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the silence settle. Outside, distant traffic hummed, birds chirped faintly, and somewhere a dog barked. Life went on as if nothing had changed, but for Marcus, everything had. The crate still sat in his driveway, its secret now revealed but not yet understood. The sun outlined its shape in a way that made it look less like a burden and more like a guardian. Marcus knew he couldn't move forward without unlocking the boxes. He knew he needed help to do it the right way, but for now, he had taken the first steps. He limped back inside, feeling the weight of exhaustion draw him toward rest again. His body demanded recovery, but his mind raced ahead. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would figure out the lockboxes tomorrow. He would find someone he could trust, someone who could guide him through the maze of legalities and risks. As he lowered himself onto the couch, he realized his living room didn't feel as empty as before. The shadows looked less hostile, the silence less oppressive. He felt watched, not by threat, but by fate. He closed his eyes slowly, letting the promise of tomorrow soften the hard edges of his thoughts. He didn't know what he had stumbled into. He didn't know whose legacy he had inherited. But Marcus Ellis finally knew one thing for certain. His life was no longer waiting for something to happen. It already had. Marcus barely slept that night. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling as hours drifted by, each marked by the slow, mechanical ticking of the clock in the hallway. His body begged for rest, but his mind kept circling the same questions, looping around the image of the lockboxes sitting in his garage, waiting. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the careful alignment of the hidden compartment, the deliberate packing of the metal boxes, the quiet precision that whispered of intention rather than accident. Men did not hide their lives away for no reason. And what Marcus had uncovered was clearly not the remnants of an ordinary life. When dawn finally reached through the curtains and painted pale stripes across the floor, he rose stiffly and moved toward the kitchen. His movements were slower than usual, weighed down by the anticipation that had settled in him like a second heartbeat. Even the familiar hiss of the kettle and the aroma of cheap coffee did little to ground him. He drank only half the cup before setting it aside and limping toward the garage, drawn by the pull of something he could no longer ignore. The air inside the garage held the cool stillness of early morning. Dust motes drifted lazily through the narrow beam of light that slipped under the door. Marcus switched on the overhead lamp, illuminating the cabinet where he had locked the boxes the night before. The metal gleamed faintly, like watchful eyes beneath the wood. He felt a tremor of recognition. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness, the kind he had felt during certain missions overseas when the air seemed to vibrate with the weight of impending revelation. He unlocked the cabinet and set the first box on the workbench. Its surface was cold, the kind of cold that didn't come from temperature alone. Marcus turned it over in his hands, searching again for a seam, a hinge, anything that would give him access without force. The recessed groove beneath the box remained as much a mystery now as it had been the previous day. Whoever designed this did so with foresight, ensuring that only someone with the proper tool could open it. A puzzle box crafted by a mind that understood both craftsmanship and secrecy. He considered trying to pry it open, but the thought felt deeply wrong. The crate's builder had left order, precision, and even clues. For Marcus to force the box open with brute strength would be to ignore the care embedded in every inch of this strange legacy. He placed the box gently back on the table and opened the leather satchel instead. Perhaps the documents inside would offer answers that the metal would not. He untied the string around the stack of papers and spread them across the workbench. The handwriting on the pages was elegant, the strokes deliberate and steady, as if the writer believed that clarity and neatness were a kind of honor. Bank receipts from the 1930s and 1940s. Pawn slips bearing signatures of shops that no longer existed. Notes about deposits made in small sums but frequently enough to suggest a lifetime of cautious accumulation. On several sheets, the names of banks were stamped in faded ink. Institutions that had merged, vanished, or collapsed generations ago. Marcus sifted through the documents slowly, feeling as though he were touching the ghost of a man who had lived during a time when trust in the financial system had been fragile, when banks failed and fortunes evaporated overnight. He imagined that fear shaping the decisions behind these papers, the careful withdrawals, the strategic storage of money in physical forms, the need to hold something tangible rather than entrust it to institutions that had betrayed so many. As he continued turning page after page, he discovered a small photograph tucked between two folded receipts. It was a black and white image of a man in his late 50s or early 60s standing beside an ornate dining table. The man's posture was proud, though his face carried a tiredness that Marcus recognized instantly, an exhaustion etched into the bones of someone who had spent a lifetime creating with his hands. In the background were shelves filled with wood carvings, intricate and beautiful, the kind of work that required decades of practice. The man held a cigarette casually between two fingers, his eyes squinting as though the flash of the camera had caught him by surprise. Marcus studied the lines of the man's face, trying to decipher the story behind them. He knew men like this, men who built rather than destroyed, who measured their worth not in accolades but in the weight of a job well done. Men who disappeared quietly into the background when their hands grew too unsteady to work and when the world moved too fast to wait for them. He felt something tighten in his chest as he placed the photograph down with reverence, as though meeting the crate's creator through a thin slice of time. The documents grew more revealing the deeper he went. Ledgers tracking the sale of handcrafted furniture to wealthy neighborhoods. Sketches of designs for pieces that would never be completed. Letters written in elegant script. Some thanking the craftsman for his work, others requesting new commissions. Marcus found himself lost in the world that this unknown builder had lived in, imagining the hours spent shaping wood into forms of beauty, the pride of creating something that would outlast its maker. Yet beneath that surface was something else. A note scrawled hastily on the edge of a ledger page caught his attention. The handwriting wavered slightly, as though written in haste or fear. It read, "If anything happens, it's all in the boxes." Marcus's breath hitched. His thoughts raced. What had the craftsman feared? What danger had loomed large enough to force him to hide his life inside a crate? And what had happened to him? Why had he never returned? He felt a shiver at the base of his spine. The lock boxes were no longer just heavy metal containers. They were the final testament of a man who had put everything he owned into hiding. And now they sat in the garage of a veteran who barely afforded his own meals. Marcus felt an uncomfortable kinship with the stranger. Both men had known the sting of being discounted, of living at the margins of a world that moved ahead without them. He closed the leather satchel and reached once more for the lockbox, unable to resist the gravitational pull it exerted. His fingers traced the engraved brass number, the recessed groove, the subtle lines that hinted at hidden mechanisms, Every detail suggested that it required something specific to open it. The thought of hunting for a tool that might have been lost decades ago weighed on him heavily. He turned the box over again and again, looking for any clue. Then he paused, recalling something he had noticed while handling the crate's exterior. The craftsmanship had extended even to the lid. The inside surface of the lid panels had faint carvings or indentations he had brushed off as decorative. But what if one of them was more? He hurried back outside, limping across the driveway. The crate still sat where he had left it, waiting like a patient sentinel. Marcus climbed into the crate's interior and examined the removed lid panel. The carvings were subtle, almost invisible unless examined up close. Lines intersected in odd patterns, not decorative after all, but deliberate. Near the corner lay a deeper mark, one he had ignored earlier in his rush. He pressed his thumb against the indentation. There was a faint click. The wood shifted, revealing a shallow compartment carved neatly into the panel. Inside lay a slender metal tool, oddly shaped and unmistakably handcrafted. It resembled the shape of the recessed groove beneath the lockbox. Marcus held the tool in his palm, marveling at how the crate's builder had left not just secrets, but the means to access them. This wasn't a crude hiding place. It was a system, a layered design meant to be uncovered step by step. It reminded him of military protocols where access to sensitive information came only after following precise procedures. But this was different. This was personal. The craftsman had designed his own vault. Marcus carried the tool with careful fingers, feeling a trembling anticipation that made his breath unsteady. Back in the garage, he inserted the tool into the recessed groove. It fit perfectly. He twisted gently, feeling resistance at first, then a smooth rotation. Something clicked inside the box, a soft mechanical sigh as though it had been waiting to be released. The lid lifted without force. What Marcus saw inside made his knees weaken. Stacks of cash sat neatly arranged, wrapped in yellowing paper bands. The bills were old but crisp, preserved with care. Next to them lay a velvet pouch containing a pocket watch with an engraved backplate. Beneath the watch, wrapped in tissue paper, were documents, official forms, letters, receipts, and something that made Marcus's breath freeze entirely. An envelope sealed with the faded insignia of a law enforcement agency. He did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, he sat back on the stool, hands trembling from shock and something deeper, from the weight of inheritance he had not asked for but now held. The cash alone was more money than he had seen in decades. The pocket watch, heavy and ornate, looked like something a collector would treasure. But it was the envelope that pulled at him. The insignia suggested involvement in something more serious than financial fear. He read a few of the papers beneath it. Pawn receipts for valuable items. A signed affidavit regarding a lost deposit box. Notes about interactions with law enforcement. Photocopies of forms that hinted at disputes, accusations, and unresolved matters. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. The craftsman had walked the line between legality and necessity, perhaps to survive, perhaps to correct something that had gone wrong in his life. He was not a criminal in the dramatic sense, but a man pushed to extremes by circumstances Marcus could only guess at. Marcus felt heavy with the realization that he was holding someone's life carved into paper and metal. Someone who had lived with fear, with caution, with a desire to protect what little he had. Someone who had, in a strange twist of fate, left it all in a storage crate that a wounded veteran would eventually claim. He wrapped the items carefully and placed them aside. The emotional weight pressed down on his ribs. His breathing grew shallow. He needed clarity. He needed to understand what this meant for him. Was he obligated to report anything? Did these documents implicate anyone still living? Was the money legally his? Marcus knew enough to understand that holding on to a discovery of this magnitude without guidance could be dangerous. He could imagine the headlines already. He had seen enough cases on the news of people who stumbled into trouble by accidentally acquiring someone else's secrets. But he also understood that whatever the law required, he needed expert advice. He closed the lockbox and placed it back into the cabinet, locking it again. The key felt heavier this time as he slipped it into his pocket. Standing in the quiet of the garage, Marcus realized that the real weight he carried was not the physical burden of the boxes, but the moral and emotional responsibility of the story they contained. And yet, beneath that burden, a new feeling glimmered softly, one he had not felt in years. Possibility. The day had begun as a continuation of yesterday's discovery, but it was already becoming something more. As he stepped out of the garage into the crisp morning air, Marcus understood that his next move could change everything. He would seek legal counsel. He would act with caution. He would not let this mystery turn into another battlefield he could not survive. But more than anything, he felt a quiet certainty growing within him. Whatever these lockboxes contained, whatever story they began, they had come into his life for a reason he did not yet understand. Tomorrow he would learn more. And, in learning, he would take back something war had nearly extinguished. Purpose. The next morning, Marcus awoke before his alarm, though the habit of setting one had long become unnecessary. The house was cold, and the light filtering through the blinds carried the muted, pale hue of a sky still deciding whether the day would be kind or cruel. For a moment, as he blinked himself awake, he forgot about the discovery in his garage. But then the memory returned like a rush of heat through his chest. The lockboxes, the cash, the documents, the pocket watch that seemed too fine for the hands that had once wound it. And the feeling, the overwhelming sense that life had finally turned toward him rather than away. He sat up slowly, stretching against the stiffness that had settled into his shoulders overnight. The familiar ache in his leg pulsed, reminding him that no revelation could erase the cost of what he had endured. Yet, today, the pain seemed more bearable, as if softened by the presence of something to look forward to. Purpose was a stubborn healer, one he had forgotten how to accept until now. He dressed carefully, choosing a clean shirt, one pressed enough to signal respect when meeting professionals. The mirror offered back the reflection of a man older than his years, creases etched by hardship rather than time. But today his eyes held a spark that hadn't lit them in a very long while. He grabbed his worn jacket, slipped the garage key into his pocket, and stepped outside. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the street and bringing with it the daily procession of neighbors hurrying to jobs or morning errands. Marcus locked his door and made his way to the bus stop. Each step echoed with determination, the steady rhythm of a soldier marching toward the unknown. He felt no fear, only the quiet resolve of a man who had survived worse. At the downtown legal office, he was greeted by the attorney he had been referred to by a fellow veteran at the senior center. Her name was Miss Carter, a woman with calm eyes and hands that folded neatly on the desk before her as she listened to everything Marcus shared, though he chose his details carefully. He described the situation in broad strokes, omitting precise amounts and certain sensitive elements, until he could be certain of the law. Still, her expression grew steadily more focused as he spoke. When he finished, she leaned back, Considering him with a kind of professional empathy Marcus found reassuring. Under storage auction statutes, she explained, anything within the purchased unit becomes legally yours, assuming the auction was conducted properly and records show the delinquency period was fulfilled. The relief that permeated Marcus's chest felt almost tangible. However, she continued, lifting a gentle caution. If any documents inside those boxes indicate criminal activity, debts owed, or ongoing legal matters, we may need to contact the appropriate authorities, not because you're in danger, but because the law favors transparency in cases involving potential victims or unresolved investigations. Marcus nodded. He understood. The military had taught him long ago that even hidden victories could come with consequences. Miss Carter offered to review the documents and appraise the value of certain items through professional channels. She gave him a list of reputable collectors and historians for the pocket watch and other antiques, then suggested he keep everything secured until their next meeting. Her guidance was clear, steady, and most importantly, hopeful. Marcus felt something inside him loosen, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. When they concluded the appointment, she stood and shook his hand, impressed by his responsibility and honesty. As Marcus left the office, sunlight bathed the sidewalk in warmth, and for the first time in years he walked with the confidence of a man who still had roads ahead worth exploring. That afternoon, Marcus returned home and sat at his kitchen table, spreading the crafted panels and tools from the crate before him. The beauty of the wood captivated him again. He lifted a carved door panel, the vines etched into it feeling alive beneath his fingertips. The craftsmanship wasn't merely skill, it was soul. Art shaped through the slow patience of hands that believed in the worth of what they created. Marcus wondered what had become of that man. A craftsman so devoted would never willingly abandon his life's work unless forced to, by fate or misfortune. The thought settled like a stone in Marcus's chest. He felt an obligation to honor that man's legacy, to ensure the work did not die unseen and unappreciated. His gaze drifted beyond the tools, beyond the lockboxes, to the world outside his window. Down the street, a homeless veteran sat hunched against a bus shelter, his tattered coat failing to shield him from the chill. Marcus recognized him as a familiar face, someone who lingered near the senior center sometimes, someone who always refused help unless it came without pity. Marcus stared for a long moment, his chest tightening. He knew that feeling. The feeling of being passed by, overlooked. The feeling of waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge that you still mattered. He thought of the government paperwork he had filed after the war, the endless forms and interviews, the polite rejection letters informing him his disability benefits covered only what they deemed sufficient. He had learned early on that survival for veterans did not come from systems. It came from each other. Slowly, Marcus rose, walked to the cabinet, and removed one stack of bills from the lockbox. Not a fortune, but enough. He stepped outside, crossing the quiet street with a familiar limp. The man looked up warily, expecting judgment, maybe hostility. Marcus simply extended his hand, the folded bills offered without explanation. The veteran stared, stunned. Before he could protest, Marcus spoke quietly. "For better days," he said. Nothing more. The man's eyes glistened as he accepted the gift with trembling fingers, nodding once in silence. Marcus turned away, the warmth in his chest chasing away the chill of the morning. That small act unlocked something deeper inside him, a memory of camaraderie and shared survival, of leaning on strangers who became brothers in trenches far from home. The world had tried to make him forget that he once belonged somewhere, that he had once been needed. Now the crate had reminded him. Word spread quietly among the veteran community. Marcus never bragged, never sought recognition, but small improvements began to ripple through their lives. He helped one man repair his wheelchair with tools found in the crate. He paid for another's medication when bureaucracy had failed. He donated carved furniture pieces to the shelter after sanding and finishing them with his own hands, using the craftsman's tools, continuing the legacy as though it had always been meant for him. Each act of kindness stitched Marcus back into the fabric of life. His house, once suffocating in its silence, now welcomed laughter and conversation. Those he helped visited often, offering gratitude in the form of companionship. They shared meals, stories, and moments of connection Marcus had assumed were lost forever. With Miss Carter's guidance, Marcus began selling carefully selected antiques and collectibles. Never too fast, never without proper authorization. The money he received wasn't extravagant by wealthy standards, but to him it was freedom. He repaired his roof, replacing shingles that had curled long ago beneath unforgiving summer heat. He replaced the creaking furnace, waking one morning to warmth that softened the bite of winter's arrival. He even fixed the porch step that had threatened to buckle each time he came home with sore joints. The funds gave him security. The work gave him purpose. The friendships gave him life. But Marcus didn't stop at his street. He visited the veterans' shelter every week now, not as a stranger, but as a benefactor and friend. He paid for new beds, warm blankets, and fresh meals. He contributed to prosthetic fittings for men and women whose sacrifice mirrored his own. Word reached local officials, though Marcus always declined public recognition. He preferred to stand in the background, watching others regain their dignity. Late one evening, he stood at his window and watched the porch light flicker softly on the home he once feared he might lose. He rested a hand over his heart, feeling the steady pulse that had long fought to keep him standing. Gratitude washed over him, heavier than the burdens he once thought insurmountable. He turned his gaze toward the garage, where the remaining lockboxes waited still. There was more to discover, more to understand about the man who had built that crate. Marcus felt certain that he had only begun to unravel a story that connected them both across time and circumstance. Tomorrow, he thought, he would open another box. Tomorrow, he would uncover another piece of a life that had somehow become intertwined with his own. Tomorrow he would take one more step toward becoming the man he had been before war tried to make him forget. As he turned away from the window, the house felt alive, filled not with echoes of loneliness, but with the soft hum of hope. Marcus Ellis breathed deeply, letting the air fill not just his lungs, but the hollow places inside him. He realized that the weight he carried now was not a burden. It was purpose. It was belonging. It was the honor of giving others the very thing he had been starving for, a second chance. And for the first time since he returned home broken and unsure, Marcus smiled at the promise of the days ahead. Time moved differently after the crate. The days no longer felt like a long, unchanging road laid out ahead of him, silent and empty. Instead, every morning, Marcus woke with a sense of direction, as though someone had quietly returned the map of his life to his hands after years of it being lost. He would rise before the first cracks of daylight, his joints protesting yet carried forward by a momentum stronger than pain. The veteran who once counted the hours between meals, between sleep and waking, now counted accomplishments, small and large, that reshaped the world around him. His home, once filled with echoes and shadows, had become a revolving door for company. Veterans came seeking advice. others seeking repairs to wheelchairs or prosthetic fittings, some simply eager to talk to someone who understood the battles that continued long after uniforms were folded away. Marcus kept the kettle ready and mugs clean. He listened more than he spoke, though when he shared, his words carried the weight of someone who had earned every syllable through experience. He did not advertise his contributions to the shelter or his quiet donations to those who needed help. There were no announcements, no grand acknowledgments. He moved through these acts the way a carpenter sands rough edges, purposefully, gently, smoothing lives one careful stroke at a time. But no matter how discreet he tried to be, gratitude has a sound sharper than silence. Soon, the shelter's walls bore new coats of paint purchased with funds Marcus provided. Broken beds were replaced with sturdy frames and thick mattresses that didn't threaten to collapse beneath tired bodies. Boxes of warm clothing appeared as if delivered by unseen hands. Wheelchairs rolled more smoothly with freshly oiled bearings and adjusted footrests. The veterans who once arrived with slumped shoulders now stood a bit taller, reminded that dignity was not something given but something returned. News, especially good news, travels like wildfire among those who have known too much bad. Visitors came to Marcus's house not with demands, but with casseroles, with awkward smiles, with company for a man who had spent so long alone he had forgotten what companionship felt like. Those new voices filled the long hours after sunset, replacing isolation with conversation, and laughter slowly crept into rooms where silence once ruled. Yet, for all the good happening around him, Marcus remained cautious. The lockboxes still held secrets he had only begun to unravel. Some nights, he sat in the garage with the boxes lined up before him like a panel of silent judges, their weight promising both danger and reward. He kept them locked unless he needed to show Miss Carter a new document for appraisal. He wasn't naive enough to believe that fortune arrived without consequences. The world had shown him again and again that everything had a price. One morning, as Marcus swept sawdust from his garage floor, he noticed a shadow pause outside the window. When he turned, all he caught was a car turning the corner. Dark glass, dark paint, too polished for the neighborhood. He told himself not to overthink, but caution stirred in his chest, patient and alert. Valuable secrets were never entirely alone, not for long. As the weeks passed, the improvements to the shelter and his own home continued steadily. He installed a proper railing along his porch steps, reinforcing the wood his own hands had once feared would give way. A delivery truck brought shingles to replace the roof, dark slate that would last longer than his lifetime. He supervised the work with a contractor he trusted, a younger man who listened attentively to Marcus's instructions, treating him not as a client but as a fellow craftsman, sharing the same respect for good work. The first snowflakes of winter drifted down the following month, settling across the yard in thin, delicate layers. Marcus stood in his driveway, the cold settling into the seam between his leg and prosthetic, watching as the world softened under white. A neighbor's child, bundled in puffy fabrics, waved at him from across the street. He waved back, a smile tugging at his mouth. It had been years since anyone outside the veteran community had regarded him with anything beyond distant politeness or forced sympathy. Now he felt seen, not for his wounds, but for his worth. Inside the house, the crate lid with its hidden compartment lay propped against the wall, the carved patterns catching the warm glow of the living room lamp. Marcus had come to see it as a symbol, the moment his life had shifted from surviving to living. He often traced the lines of the design absent-mindedly while sitting in his armchair, as though trying to read the message etched into every curve and groove. He held on to the pocket watch at times as well, feeling its smooth case and imagining the stories it had kept. He couldn't bring himself to sell it. Some treasures were meant to remain with their new owner, belonging not by law, but by fate. Eventually, appraisal results began to return. The watch alone was worth more money than Marcus had earned in several years combined. Collectors placed bids on surveying tools, and the rare books found beneath layers of canvas brought surprising attention from historians. Miss Carter helped him handle each transaction securely, making sure no one could take advantage of the man who had already been taken from too many times by life. But what mattered most to Marcus was how the money moved outward from his hands to others. When asked why he did it, he didn't have a speech prepared. He simply said, "I've had help when I needed it. This is my turn." Still, his generosity brought unexpected outcomes. A local journalist learned of the contributions to the shelter and requested an interview. Marcus declined. A council member invited him to speak at a community event honoring veterans. He declined. An organization offered to nominate him for an award. He declined that too. He was not doing any of this for recognition or prestige. The moment gratitude became applause, the purpose behind it all might become diluted. Despite his attempts to stay out of the spotlight, small tokens of appreciation appeared. A knitted blanket with his initials from a man whose neuropathy made his hands tremble. A framed photograph signed by veterans at the shelter, thanking him for the nights they slept without shivering. Cookies left on his porch by a widow who never forgot how Marcus had fixed her broken mailbox without being asked. Each gesture touched him deeply, the kind of warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in too long. As his connection strengthened, his home became a hub, not of charity, but of community. On Friday evenings, a group of veterans would gather at his kitchen table, playing cards and swapping stories over coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Marcus sat at the head of the table, prosthetic leg propped comfortably, laughter shaping the air around him. He no longer felt like a relic of a war the world preferred to forget. Here, he was commander again, not by rank, but by respect. It wasn't only veterans who stood to benefit from his new purpose. Marcus noticed an older woman down the block struggling to carry groceries, her back curved and trembling with the effort. He crossed the street without hesitation, taking the bags from her arms. When she thanked him, embarrassed by her own weakness, he smiled gently and said, "We all need a hand sometimes." He began checking on her weekly, mowing her lawn when spring returned, fixing her porch light when summer arrived, sitting with her on slow afternoons when conversations were worth more than any currency. The money from the crate had made his life easier, but it was the giving that made his life meaningful. On a particularly cold evening, as Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, unlacing his shoe and adjusting the strap on his prosthetic, he paused to reflect. His heart felt full of purpose, full of gratitude, full of a sense of belonging he thought he had forfeited when he boarded that plane home from war. He stared at his reflection in the window, surprised by the man he saw. He was still aging, still scarred, still tired in ways sleep could not fix. But now, he stood stronger than he had in years. The crate had not restored his missing leg or erased the memories that sometimes stalked his dreams. But it had given him something far more powerful. A reason to keep moving forward. The knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found a young man standing there with a shy smile. Someone Marcus recognized from the shelter. someone who had once shown up wearing a coat far too thin for winter's bite. "Just wanted to say thank you," the young man murmured, holding out a folded blanket. "You've done more than you know." Marcus accepted the blanket with a nod, his throat tightening with emotion. After the man left, he unfolded the gift and felt the soft fabric beneath his fingers. He wrapped it over his knees as he sat quietly, letting its warmth settle deep into his bones. He thought again of the crates in the garage and realized something had changed beyond his home and the neighborhood. His world had expanded outward, reclaiming the parts of him that war had tried to strip away. And though challenges remained, they were no longer his alone to carry. Outside, snowflakes continued their silent fall, blanketing the earth in new beginnings. Marcus closed his eyes and listened to the soft ticking from the pocket watch resting on the table beside him, a reminder that time, once a burden, was now a gift. Whatever secrets still waited in those boxes, whatever truths he had yet to uncover, Marcus knew he could face them, because he was no longer standing alone in his fight. He had found, in the most unexpected way, not only resources but a reason to rise every morning with purpose humming steady beneath his ribs. And that, more than anything, felt like victory. Winter loosened its grip on the town slowly, as though reluctant to surrender. For weeks the cold clung to windows and sidewalks, but each day grew a little brighter, a little softer, as sunlight lingered longer on Marcus's porch. The snow melted into rivulets that whispered along the edges of driveways and fed sprouting blades of grass. Birds returned, testing their voices in cautious morning songs. It was the kind of seasonal shift that ordinary people took for granted, but Marcus felt it like a physical thaw inside him. Life, both around him and within him, was warming again. He had never imagined that his twilight years would unfold like this, surrounded not by solitude but by people who valued his company. Strengthened not by war, but by humanity rediscovered. He had repaired wheels and roofs, but more importantly, he had repaired bonds between forgotten souls. He had replaced broken boards and rotten shingles, but he had also replaced despair with dignity. He had discovered that generosity did not diminish the giver, but somehow expanded them. And in return, others cared for him. They stopped by with groceries unasked for. They shoveled his walkway without letting him rise from his bed on icy mornings. They filled his evenings with laughter and stories, invited him to cookouts and card games, and reminded him daily that although the war had taken much from him, it had not taken his place in the world. But, for all the outward changes, Marcus carried a quiet understanding that it was not only his own life he had stepped into, it was the unfinished life of the craftsman who had hidden his legacy inside that crate. A life that had been interrupted, packed away in a secret compartment where time would not erode its worth. Marcus felt the responsibility of it, not as a burden, but as a sacred duty. He could not repay the man who had built every piece with his bare hands and fierce pride, but he could ensure that those creations, and the purpose behind them, continued to breathe. In early spring, Marcus returned to the shelter with a new idea, one that had grown steadily in his mind as the snow fell outside his window. The organization had long dreamt of opening a small vocational program, something to give veterans practical skills and a renewed sense of purpose. However, funding always slipped just out of reach, and the dream remained a hopeful sketch pinned to a bulletin board. Marcus walked into the director's office with a folder of documents and a quiet resolve. Inside the folder was his plan: to donate the remaining funds he had secured from selling the antique items, and to create a workshop space where veterans could learn woodworking, restoration, and craftsmanship. Skills that healed more than they built. Skills that aligned with the legacy in his garage. He presented the idea without embellishment, as if describing the simplest thing in the world. The director's eyes filled with shocked gratitude. She reached across the table to take Marcus's hand, unable to find words for the magnitude of what he had offered. "It's not charity," Marcus said softly, gripping her hand with the steady assurance of a man who had found his mission. "It's opportunity. And people gave me that when I needed it most." Construction began that very month. The workshop grew from empty storage rooms behind the shelter into a place filled with sawdust, polished counters, and sturdy benches. The carved door panels from the crate, cleaned, treated, and restored, hung proudly on the walls as inspiration. The chisels, planes, and tools of the unknown craftsman were displayed in cabinets not as relics, but as reminders of skill and passion. Some tools Marcus kept for himself, but most he donated to the workshop, feeling they belonged there, shaping new hands into creators. Each time he walked into that space, he wondered if the man in the photograph, cigarette balanced in his fingers, would approve. Marcus hoped he would. He hoped the man would see not loss in the fact that his work had been hidden away, but redemption in the fact that his tools were shaping new stories, new futures. By early summer, the workshop program opened to its first group of veterans, men and women whose scars were visible and invisible alike. Marcus found himself teaching them how to measure and sand, how to coax beauty from flawed wood, how to find rhythm in creation. He guided them not as a master craftsman, but as a man who understood what it meant to rebuild a life one small accomplishment at a time. He didn't speak often about his own battles, but when someone struggled, hands shaken, mind wandering somewhere dark, Marcus would rest a calming touch on their shoulder and say, "Steady, you're stronger than the memory." Those simple words, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who had lived them, worked better than any speech. The shelter held a celebration when the workshop finished its first successful round of projects. Small tables, chairs, keepsake boxes, all coated with varnish and pride. Community members came to see the work and meet the artisans. Some offered commissions. Others offered thanks. Marcus stood off to the side, content to watch from a comfortable distance. But within that comfort, a new thought found him. He could feel time brushing against him in gentle reminders. His joints stiffened faster in the evenings. His steps grew slower when rain approached. He was not a young man building his future. He was a veteran shaping the future of others. And a part of him cherished the knowledge that when his time eventually came to rest, something good would continue, because he had lived. A few months later, the shelter invited Marcus to attend a small ceremony, a commemoration of veterans past and present. Marcus had declined public recognition before, but this time felt different. It wasn't about him. It was about honoring those who had helped shape the world while the world sometimes forgot to thank them. He accepted the invitation with a nod, though he didn't fully grasp how meaningful the evening would become. The ceremony took place at dusk. Lanterns glowed softly as chairs were arranged neatly beneath a canopy of summer stars. Veterans stood among civilians, sharing space without hierarchy. The director took the podium and spoke about resilience, about community, and about the power of a single act of kindness to spark change. Then she gestured toward a covered structure near the workshop entrance. The cloth was pulled away, revealing a polished plaque affixed to the brick. The inscription shimmered beneath the lights. "In honor of those who served and the hands that helped them rebuild." The metal surface caught Marcus's breath in his throat. Beneath the dedication was a line smaller but somehow heavier. Founders, the veterans of our community, and Marcus Ellis. The applause that followed rolled through the air like a soft wave. People turned to look at Marcus, faces lit with gratitude, admiration, acknowledgement. He felt heat rush into his cheeks and his heart stammer beneath the weight of attention. A man beside him, once too broken to speak above a whisper, clapped louder than anyone else. Marcus stood still, absorbing the moment like sunlight after a long winter. He did not step forward. He didn't need to. Simply being there was enough. This wasn't a stage he had to stand upon. This was a home he had helped build. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and lanterns dimmed, Marcus lingered near the workshop door. Through the window, he saw the tools resting quietly on their hooks, the chisels glinting softly, their purpose renewed. The pocket watch in his jacket vibrated faintly as he shifted his weight. He reached inside and held it gently, listening to the steady tick, a rhythm that promised more time still left to use well. He walked home slowly beneath the night sky, cane tapping a steady beat along the sidewalk. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and summer's fading warmth. When he reached his porch, he paused, looking across the street at the storage crate now long gone from his yard. All that remained of it was the memory of discovery and the life it had grown into. In his living room, he eased himself into his chair, wrapped the gifted blanket over his knees, and set the pocket watch on the table beside him. The house no longer felt too quiet. It hummed with the memory of every voice that had filled it these past months. Marcus reached for his notebook, the one where he had written down the details of the crate, the pages now thick with notes and thoughts about the journey that had unfolded. He opened to a fresh page, staring at the empty space waiting for ink. After a long moment of reflection, he began to write. Not about the money or the antiques or the legal documents, but about the lessons the crate had delivered into his hands, about legacy, about unexpected blessings, about the truth that even broken things can carry extraordinary gifts. He wrote until his hand tired, signing the page with a stamp of quiet pride. When he set the notebook down, he leaned back and closed his eyes. The clock ticked steadily. His heart answered. He felt full, whole, useful. The world outside his window kept turning, oblivious to the veteran who had rediscovered his worth, but the people whose lives he touched would remember. The plaque would remain long after his hands stilled. The workshop would shape futures he would never meet. And somewhere, perhaps beyond time, the craftsman would know his life's work had found a purpose far greater than what he had intended. Marcus Ellis smiled, the lines of his face softening. He breathed deeply, letting the quiet settle, not as emptiness, but as peace. He had lived long enough to know that not every legacy is written in medals or monuments. Some are etched into the lives we help rebuild. Some are carved into the hearts we uplift. Some are tucked away in crates, waiting for the right hands to open them. And some remain, steady as a heartbeat, long after the hands that forged them are gone. Here, in the soft glow of his lamp, Marcus understood something with absolute clarity. Good choices, made patiently and honestly, always guide a person home. And he was home at last. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next videos. Don't stop here. Check out our other incredible stories waiting for you, and share this video with friends and family, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more amazing tales to life.